This one, we're going to be chatting about Conquest of Bread, chapters 10 and 11.
Yep, so we're here looking at 10 and 11. So, I'm on the wrong page here. 10 and 11. So 10 is agreeable work, basically getting to what kind of work people should do and how much say do they have in that work that they were doing. And he kind of covers two different topics here. He also gets very much into women's rights and their say in the workplace and what type of work they should be expected to do versus what type of work they can be choosing to do on their own accord. So I actually kind of felt like it could have been two different chapters, but I guess those two ideas are very closely related. But there's kind of the people in general deciding what kind of work should be done versus, a segment of the population, which is, fairly forward thinking of him. Right. Considering this was quite a while ago for him to recognize that, that there's always these assumptions about what type of work women should be doing, right? Which we now look at as being sort of ancient ways of thinking about it. It's not really a modern view of just assuming that women should be doing the cooking and the house cleaning and raising of the kids and stuff like that. And he points that out and says in a different situation, where you've removed the government, you've removed capitalism, women would be able to make these kinds of choices about what type of work they should do. And then it would actually improve things for everyone because you would have this whole new people in the workforce that could either, decide to stay home and clean or go out and work in a factory or whatever they wanted to do. And then he talks about this idea of not everyone having to cook their own food. So instead of having 50 separate fires where 50 people need to have coal or wood or whatever to burn their fires to cook their meals at home, you could have a big, like a commune. So instead of 50 different people preparing beans for the meal, you could have, in one neighborhood, one person cooks a massive amount of beans, and then everyone just comes and gets a large bowl of it and brings it home for their family. And this would greatly reduce the amount of fuel needed for all these fires. You'd have one big fire rather than 50 tiny fires, which would, you need a lot less coal or whatever it is that you're using as a fuel. And it would also decrease the amount of time that was needed. So rather than having whether it be a man or woman in 50 different households all doing this cooking, it's much quicker to just show up somewhere, get your beans, come back home or whatever it is that they're all sort of sharing and working on it that way. So I found that kind of interesting.
Yeah, what I find interesting is, so this chapter, Agreeable Work, is really in some respects a chapter about organization of work, right? And he again is trying to link together domestic work and sort of what we typically think of work in terms of sort of production and the use of machines. In fact, he has a great quote at the very end of the chapter. He says here, quote, "Because those who want to emancipate mankind have not included women in their dream of emancipation and consider it beneath their superior masculine dignity to think of those kitchen arrangements which they have put on the shoulders of that drudge woman." And so, really linking in there the idea of organization and how if we're going to talk about organizing a society, it must include liberation and emancipation for women. And if it doesn't include that, it's not real emancipation. Right. And he uses a great example in this book, specifically talking about examples of communists or Jacobins who would be having conversations with their wives. And they would say, well, who may be sort of bourgeois or something like that, but are socialists apparently, saying that like, oh, well, if there was a revolution, you would be eager to do the work in the same way that Jack's husband or Jack's wife does, or John's wife does, the carpenter or the shoemaker. Like, you would be willing to do that as well. Clearly showing how there are large sections, at least in his time, of socialists who were not really thinking about domestic work and reallocating domestic labor in a way which could be emancipatory and freeing for women. And he uses really great examples of that, but he really kicks it off because, again, it's in many respects a chapter about the organization of society. How do we actually organize society in a kind of what he thinks of as rational way. And he kicks it off by talking about factories and how factories can be made more clean and more healthy for individuals. So he has a great line right at the beginning of chapter 10. He says here, quote, it's the start of the second paragraph. He says, it is evident that a factory could be made as healthy and as pleasant as a scientific laboratory. And it is no less evident that it would be advantageous to make it so. In a spacious and well-ventilated factory, the work is better. It is easy to introduce small ameliorations, and of which each would represent an economy of time and of manual labor. And so the idea being there that if you increase the well-being for individuals in the factory, that it seemingly will automatically increase the efficiency as well, right? So if you make it more spacious, you make it more well-ventilated, you give workers what they need, it automatically means that society is going to get more pleasant and that the output is going to increase as well. So in other words, if we want to talk about the organization of society, we have to be talking about the organization of society for the workers as well. And that's a really important angle to put on it. Now, there are a few questions that I'm going to raise in a few minutes about how he's particularly framing it, but I think that that's a valuable way to think about it, at the very least. I don't know. What do you think?
I think you also gain in this idea where, if people are happy at work, they're going to do better work. I mean, I've really worked some rubbish jobs growing up that I'm glad I will hopefully never have to go and work anything like that again. But some circumstances that are unpleasant, and not unpleasant in the way this is, where it's like run down unhealthy factories and stuff like that. But just having that work be a drudge, and you don't really want to be there. It's dark. It's maybe damp. It's an unpleasant workplace. People aren't just not going. If you don't enjoy being there, you're not going to do as good a work. So this idea that if you let workers decide how the factory should work, they will create it in a way that they are, they want to come to work and do the kind of work that they want to do, and that they can make those kind of choices. I remember working some kind of these terrible jobs, and a lot of times you would have rules handed down from the top that were ridiculous. They didn't even make sense for the business, but someone had decided, here's what we're going to do. And it actually gets in the way of you doing the good work that you want to do. You're just running around like following these rules instead of just all my effort is going into producing whatever our factory needs to produce for the day, getting that work done. And then we can all go home and, stream or whatever it is that we're going to do at the end of the day.
Right.
So, this idea, I think there's value in this idea of letting workers have a say in the workplace rather than just handing it down in this hierarchy. I think there's benefits to that.
Right, and I do agree with that, certainly. I mean, he even says so much. He says, nevertheless, now and again, this is the start of the third paragraph, nevertheless, now and again, we already find, even now, some factories so well managed that it would be a real pleasure to work in them if the work, it well be understood, were not to last more than 4 or 5 hours a day, and if everyone had the possibility of varying it according to his taste. Today, we would add her taste as well. And so, it's really, I think, a good way to think about the issue of organization and to think about the issues of efficiency, right? Like, think about efficiency and think about organization in favor of the workers. Now, where I think he maybe starts to run into trouble is that he seems to assume later into the chapter that anytime you do this, or that whenever you maximize the efficiency or well-being for others, whenever you maximize well-being for the individuals in the factories, you are maximizing organization, and that therefore you're going to be increasing their labor. I think maybe, but I think that we should try to disentangle the efficiency angle of it from the moral angle of it. Yeah, you should have a moral obligation and just make a moral case for why workers should, have control of the means of productions, make a moral case for why workers are able to organize their factories and why, this is going to be good for the workers. But some maybe disentangling it a little bit from the efficiency case might be good, because I'm sure there probably are some examples where actually it's cheaper and more efficient to just put up nets over the Apple factory as opposed to, providing them better pay and health care, et cetera, so that they don't commit suicide. And I wouldn't want our argument to then hinge on some kind of scientific claim about morality. But let me get into why I think that he's saying this, and maybe I'm just interpreting it wrong. But I think that it is sort of in line with some of the other things that he's said earlier in the book. But anyway, so he's giving this example of how he was touring a factory for, I believe it was the creation of some kind of metal or something of the sort, and he's talking about how beautiful it was. It was as well swept, like the bricks were super well swept. Everything was very clean. The gardens were well tended around the factory. It was beautiful and large. There was glass ceilings in parts of the factory. And then when he's starting to ask questions about the efficiency and why it wasn't so loud, why it wasn't so hot and sweaty for the workers, he says here, and again, this is him on a sort of tour with the manager of the factory. He says, "Well, it's a mere question of economy. This machine and that plain steel has been in this machine, that plain steel, has been in use for 42 years. It would not have lasted 10 years if the parts had been badly adjusted and interfered and creaked and cracked at every movement of the plane." And the blast furnace, he asks, "Well, it would be a waste to let the heat escape instead of utilizing it. Why roast the founders and the workers when heat is lost by radiation represents tons of coal? The stampers that made the building shake 5 leagues off were also a waste. Is it not better to forge by pressure than by impact, and it costs less? There is less loss." And so basically, he's arguing that it's a much cleaner, much more efficient way to organize production by, making it so that the heat isn't getting escaped, by making it quieter, because, whenever there's loud noises, it means that the parts aren't well adjusted. And so you make the parts well adjusted. It turns out by incidence, that's making it more efficient, but by incidence, it's also making it quieter, which is much more pleasant for the worker. And so I think that there's an interesting kind of connection which he's drawing here between sort of rational organization, where again, he's defining organization as the maximization of well-being for the individuals in the workplace, and kind of a moral maximization as well, which isn't quite maybe as argued for. And we did see similar echoes of this earlier in the book at the very beginning when he was talking about issues of pseudoscience and how the development of pseudosciences and economics would undermine our own moral standing by making us, sort of lying in order to self-justify a system. He argues that we're the kind of people who rationalize our situations. And so if we have an irrational system, he argued earlier in the book, it means that we're going to be forced to lie in order to sort of and develop pseudosciences in order to self-justify the economy, and that makes us, by dint of just having an irrational society, makes us less moral people. And so I think that there's a kind of interesting correlation about how he's thinking about morality in this book. Again, I think that he's making a really good case for making workplaces better, but I think that he might be doing a little bit more maybe than he really can with the arguments that he's giving us. Maybe I'm wrong, though.
They're definitely, I would say, in these two chapters, I would say his writing is not maybe as tight as it has been in the previous chapters. I mean, he's starting to give examples here, but feel like he definitely didn't fill every case. He didn't fill every hole that's, every possible thing that someone could object to. I think what he's trying to do here is to give counters to the immediate questions or responses that people give that would be knocks against this kind of a system. As to his idea of efficiency, I guess I'm just the type of individual when it comes to work. I do think that efficiency, or at least for me, in general, does lead to better work, because efficiency effectively involves loss, right? You have some type of loss that you didn't gain from. And so any of that loss along the way means I have to work longer or I have to work harder in order to make up for that inefficiency, for that loss. So I think it would... I guess I see his argument that inefficiency does degrade the workplace, which then degrades, the work that we're doing overall. Now, it might be a bit of a stretch to say that's enough to make the whole argument that he's trying to make, but I think it's maybe definitely a brick in the argument, that needs to be set forth in order to make this case.
Right, I agree. I mean, the thing is, like, he's not necessarily making a case argument, which would require some kind of like inductive set of, like this or like this case, that case, and that other case. He's not really making a case argument. He seems to be making a deductive case. So I think that polls could be particularly damning. I don't know, maybe. But anyway, so he's linking this idea of organization into women, and how when we talk about the organization of society, we have to be talking about the organization of domestic labor as well. Otherwise, again, the quote that I'm reading earlier, well, we've just left out half of society, right. And that's really, really bad. In fact, he concludes he concludes this chapter with a quote here saying, Only let us fully understand that a revolution intoxicated with the beautiful words liberty, equality, solidarity would not be a revolution if it maintained slavery at home. Half of humanity subjected to the slavery of the hearth would still have to rebel against the other half. And so you haven't had a revolution unless you've liberated women, unless you've provided emancipation for women. And the specific sort of emancipation which he's envisioning for women is the emancipation from household labor. And the way that he thinks that this emancipation could occur is through some kind of scientific development and machines which could make labor easier for women, first of all, and second of all, through a reorganization of how we sort of live together. So he gives examples of how you could have basically like sort of housemaids kind of come through and they wouldn't have to be women, of course, obviously, but like, you know, you'd have workers come through and prepare your breakfast. You'd have workers come through and clean your bed sheets. You'd have workers come through and possibly clean your chimneys, shine your shoes, and all of that kind of household work. And they do it for, you know, maybe a block of houses. And you know, you'd throw your shoes in the bin and then they'd come back tomorrow. They'd provide you breakfast, because he argues that it's, you know, just a really big waste to have you know, like a ton of different fires being lit in order to produce food for all of these different homes. Maybe you should just centralize that and, you know, come and basically, you know, be able to choose between having meals in common and between having meals by yourself. Because he, you know, he gives this interesting example of how like solitary confinement is bad because you are forced to be alone. But then prisons are bad because you're forced to always be together. And so you're never being able to give solace. And so the balance, or the proper life, he argues, is one in which we can choose when to be alone and when not to be alone, when to be able to find you know, time to yourself and solitude, and when to be able to socialize, that we need both and that we need to be able to choose either way. And if we can't choose that, then we're not free, he seems to think. And that really is like a very linchpin understanding for him of what it means to be free, the ability to choose socialization. He criticizes the Christian approach a little bit, the Christian approach being that, you know, you'd come and have your meals in common. This is, of course, the history of the Eucharist, where the Eucharist being, you know, sort of what today a lot of Protestants will call communion, right? And having meals in common, and that when we share the meal in common as Christians, you'd say, well, you're eating the body of Christ and drinking the blood of Christ. And there's actually some really interesting Roman literature like describing early communion meals, and just thinking like, what the heck are these people doing? But anyway, like he says that, like, you know, this is forcing us to always have meals in common, and that this is maybe not the best way to go about it. So he seems to have some interesting ideas about meals, but he thinks that this is all very deeply tied up with women and liberating women. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I think the like I mentioned earlier, I'm super impressed that for the time that he was in, that he was able to stand up for women and recognize that there was definitely an inequity and inequality going on there that needed to be addressed, and that he put it in his work. He wasn't afraid to put it in there for backlash or something like that. He put it in there and went with it. And the idea of community, I guess, like this case or the discussion we're having about how well he kind of proves his case, I guess it makes me think back to earlier in the book when he mentioned that, he kind of said that we don't have a perfect prescription for how everything would work. I feel like he's kind of giving examples that are counterexamples to objections that people would bring, but he's not necessarily saying this is the blueprint for how we have to do everything. He's just saying this is one possibility of how this could come about. Especially how individualistic we are in the United States. I don't know that all of these would come into play. I don't know that we'd have a neighborhood, someone cooking for the whole neighborhood, and then you would come get your food, or you'd have a couple houses each cooking some stuff for the neighborhood. I don't know if that would really fly, but it's a possibility of ways we could achieve things, because I think it's back to this efficiency of, if we can find all these different ways to eliminate the inefficiencies we have in society, suddenly we find ourselves with all this different time. Because this argument at first seems a little unbelievable. I know at first I was a little taken aback when he's like, yeah, we can get away with only working a few hours a day, 5 days a week. It's like, what? But then when you start noticing all these inefficiencies that we could remove, we all have the different fuel for our fires, and we all have, all this different stuff. You go, oh, actually, we could greatly reduce my needs, which means if we're all trying to meet the society's needs, and we've all lowered our needs, but we're still getting those needs met. Like we have the same needs, but we've reduced the amount of effort it takes to reach those needs because we're more efficient. Then, yeah, logically, it seems like we would get to a better place that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting again, like he's linking in the importance of organization with the ability to emancipate people, right? So he thinks that it's just again irrational to have all these fires burning around the house, and he talks about how it's such a waste of time to have what he says is 1/10 of the European population shining shoes, right? That this is just like a complete waste, right? You should maximize efficiency by just sort of I guess delegating resource or delegating the tasks to a few people and then have them just basically be that like the only thing that they sort of do. And that he seems to think that this is again like really tied in with the liberation and emancipation of women. What I find really interesting though is that he's really relying on technology in many ways to liberate women. So he uses an example, for instance, of this dishwasher machine, what today we would call a dishwasher. He says it was invented by some woman, Miss Crockrane. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. Solved it with this machine that allows you to put 12 dishes or 12 plates or dishes into this machine, and apparently wipes them and then dries them in under 3 minutes. My dishwasher does not go within 3 minutes,
Right.
but I am, I suppose, able to put in more than three dishes. Now, I will say about this is it's interesting, right? Because he seems to think that, you put in these technologies, and then as a result of that, women will be truly free to go about and do what they want. What I find interesting about that is there actually has been some interesting writings about how women were like given accorded more and more respect over time. It's still a project obviously that we're working on, but some feminist sociologists are starting to think that it actually was the bringing in technologies into the household which allowed women to go out and get a job. They didn't have to spend as much time. And I mean, that makes you wonder like what really came first. Was it less sexism that allowed, like, I mean, there's a kind of, I suppose, chicken and the egg thing. But he does give a really good example here. I'm not sure where the quote is exactly, but he basically says, I don't know if you have it, Chris, but he basically says that like it's not sufficient to talk about women emancipation if by that we only mean giving them access to the law courts, we only mean giving them access to jobs and workplace. We also have to emancipate them from the work that they have to do in the household. I'm not quite sure where that quote is right in front of me, but it's a really great and interesting quote about how he's thinking about emancipation. Now, obviously, he uses the word only, like he is saying specifically that we need to obviously make sure that women have access to the law courts, that women are equal under the law, but that he is also really focusing on the work angle of it, the making sure that women are not being demanded of, that they have to handle the domestic labor as well, on top of things, and that this isn't just like a patriarchy where all of the free labor time is just going to be absorbed by men. It has to be shared in equal between men and women. So again, I think, Chris, you're really right that he's focusing in on this when a number of socialists at the time, as he criticizes in this text, were not thinking about this. And I think that this is certainly a mark to his credit.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. So you want to move on to chapter 11, or were there more points?
I think that wraps up chapter 10 pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah. I will say he also talks about like the ability of electricity and electric. This is still in chapter 10, electricity and electric light, how this is also going to like really help women as well, because they'll be able to like, I guess, they won't have to be cleaning, I guess, the lights. I don't know enough about how like old gas lights work, so he says that like they'd have to clean them. I don't know, but I guess that's how they used to work. So it's interesting that like he sees these things as so deeply tied up with women's liberation, whereas today I don't think that any history textbook would use like the example of lighting as examples of women sort of being, I don't know the word that you would use, but like I find it interesting that this sort of prognostication is very different than the retroactive history that I suppose we read. Oftentimes, Chris, like when I was reading about the women's movement, like in school, we would focus on like the marches and how they were given the right to vote, and how, for instance, like women were given jobs during the world wars, and they like proved themselves. I always found that like a bit of a bizarre example,
Hmm.
but that was how my history class taught me. It was like, oh, look at all these women who went to go to work during World War I or during the Civil War, and that this like really afforded them respect, and it like proved that they could do. I always found that was a bit bizarre, but anyway, I suppose that like the history that I was taught was very different than some of the stuff that feminist scholars are coming out with now, and as well as what Kropotkin is saying in the book as well.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
So on to a chapter 11. Chris, do you have any like sort of main things to say about chapter 11, or?
Yeah, so this was kind of a longer chapter, and the second half, he's just kind of giving a lot of examples, which are interesting to look at, but I don't know that by themselves they definitely like completely make the point that he's trying to make. But they are interesting. So this is the one. Let me catch my place here. Free agreement. So this is where he's basically talking about the state and should the state be involved, and can you organize without the state? If you don't have the state, they're kind of putting things together and making sure that there's some sort of organization, that things will start to fall apart. So he makes a number of cases that you can really do incredible things without the state coming through and making these decisions. And one of the arguments he gives is this massive railroad system where by his example, he's essentially saying that this was just put together through self-organization. You had small groups that were working together in order to make this railroad be successful, and that you don't need a state stepping in. And sometimes when you do, like he gives an example, I think it was from Russia or something, where he talks about the government making a decision about a railroad, but it was hugely resource intensive. Right, because they said, oh, instead of taking this circuitous route, we're just going to draw a straight line and just go straight from A to B. But you had to like fill in ravines and all sorts of stuff. So a huge amount of effort being put forth into satisfying the government, this person at the top who just, it was very easy for him to just draw this line and say, do it this way, everybody. And then, the whole nation kind of had to throw whatever resources were necessary into getting that job done. And that maybe if you have groups working together, you still can get the job done, but maybe even in a better way. And certainly, back to the efficiency argument, probably with a better degree of efficiency, at least compared to the cases that he gave. Now, he was choosing these cases, seems to be kind of cases on the extreme. He picked one extreme, which seemed unreasonable with the level of resources that it took, and then comparing it to where we had some sort of self-organization going on. But I think he does, maybe not prove the entire case, but he makes a point here that self-organization, I think, can go further than we necessarily assume that it can.
Yeah, so I mean, he really kicks off this story again. It's about free agreement. He's arguing that free agreement is superior to the state, which he sort of conflates with unfree agreement, that you're forced to do things. And going to the railroad example, I mean, I'll have more to say about it in a few minutes, but I think you're right to point out how Kropotkin is saying, well, look, if you have people on the ground making the decisions, actual workers who would know, they would have more information about what would be required in order to do this, that, or the other thing. You have governments who are supposed to be like kind of jack of all trades, or politicians are kind of, the jack of all trades, supposedly, like a good one, who knows a little bit about everything, and that makes it kind of, I suppose, a good politician, that they're not really going to know all the information on the ground. But sort of going through the chapter, so he kicks it off really interesting with just a typical example here. Is that we're basically accustomed by training and how we were raised up to think that, quote, we would have to become, that we would have come to believe that men would tear themselves and tear their fellow men to pieces like wild beasts the day that the police took their eyes off them. And so, the idea being, of course, I think that we still see this very often today, that, if police officers were to stop patrolling communities, oftentimes minority communities, well, what that, of course, would automatically mean is that police officers or that, the community would just immediately descend into violence and descend into chaos. He doesn't seem to think that that would be the case. And he goes into examples of how we're sort of and to sort of justify this conclusion, he uses examples, and I found this quite interesting. How, our entire life we're focused on the actions of government as if the actions of government, or I should say, the actions of the state, and how the actions of the state are conflated with the actions of a people or an actions of a nation. So he talks about how newspapers are entirely consume themselves with political jobbery, what he calls political jobbery, and that, if you are coming from another world, if you're an alien, we've been seeing some interesting UFO videos and stuff like that coming out, but if an alien were to read our newspapers, they would think that nothing happens in all of Europe except for stock exchange transactions, and that, quote, nothing gets done except for saved by the order of some master. And so, that's the only way that we can organize ourselves, and that this is really misleading. He talks about how in newspapers, things will only ever be mentioned, no matter how important, if police have appeared on the scene. And so the entire way that we think about our society, the way that we think about our own organization, is through the government, through the lens of the state. And Chris, I found that really interesting because, I've been thinking for a while about the kinds of videos that I make, the kinds of videos that you make. And, one of the things that was so interesting about Andrew Yang's campaign, look, I supported Bernie Sanders throughout the primary, but one of the things that was interesting about Andrew Yang's campaign is that he was bringing issues which were political issues. They were political questions that had an audience to them about issues of AI, but were not considered, serious political questions that are dealt with in Washington. Issues of AI, issues of competition resulting from AI, and things like this. That these are things that are political. They are political 100%, not any less political than, issues of tax credits and the like, but that the government traditionally hasn't been handling it. And so they're seen as less serious. They're seen as not politicized debates. They're not seen as like, the serious list of issues which politicians are supposed to care about. And I don't know, like, I find this interesting. Like, I don't know, Chris, like, how do we think about this problem? Because I think that he is right here. At least partially. What do you think?
To say, sorry, can you just summarize the question?
Yeah. Like he is right in a certain sense to think that we focus too much on the actions of government and assume that the actions of the state or the actions of government are political news. That anything that happens in government, well, that's politics. But things that happen in free enterprise, things that happens in the church, that these things are not politics. But in a certain sense, they are, and they might be just as much, if not more, political than the things that happen in the state. So we end up in a situation where news is anything that is considered to be the limits of the state's domain.
Right.
And so we might end up having a very skewed, misrepresentative view of what's going on in society, what's going on in our nation, and in our in our community, indeed, if we just conflate news with what the government or things that involve the state actually do, and that we might have a very distorted view of the world if we doing political commentary as we do on our channels. Maybe we're just completely doing it wrong, maybe.
Yeah, like we need to sort of encompass everything together. I mean, you were kind of making before we were going, you were talking about how Kropotkin is making the case that the capitalists and the government are sort of very similar, and I feel like we see that in today's society. Like, where do the banks end and the governments pick up, right? Where do the oil companies end and McConnell starts? Like, all these individuals, it's like it's pretty hard to define that defining line between the capitalists and the government in this day and age. And there's even a quote in here where he talks about they forgot to prove to us that it is possible to put an end to exploitation while the primal causes, private capital and poverty, 2/3 of which are artificially created by the state, continue to exist. So he's kind of making that same argument there where all these things are related. And I think it doesn't help the way we treat this two-party system in this country where you feel like you're on one team and you're always looking to kind of prove the other team is wrong and that your team is right. And it keeps us, like you were saying with the news, where you sort of view the news through this lens of, is that part of the government? If it's a politician that says something you don't like, then that becomes newsworthy. But we may be missing the fact that, Bezos is getting very, very rich while his workers are still in that poverty type situation, which is very much politics, I think.
Right. And these things are just as much news and just as much politics as are things that go on in the government. And even, sort of extends this argument by talking about how we think about history. He talks about how our histories are only histories of parliament, our sort of bourgeois histories. But then if we try to make any historian who tries to make a history about actual social life and things that are going on in the day-to-day, that their work is ultimately neglected. Now, fortunately, that has changed to some extent since Kropotkin's time. There has been a lot of real effort in history to avoid kind of only doing sort of bourgeois and nationalist histories. Lots of histories now will focus specifically in on people groups and people groups in specific time periods. So there has been a lot of change in that regard. But I think he is right to talk about how our entire lens of social life is really angled in a way which forces us to think that government and the state is the only way to organize our social life. And certainly, like, I agree, right? Like, the state is a relatively new invention. You can literally read the lines in Hobbes and the work of Thomas Hobbes, where he invents the concept of the state, and then the state ended up being enacted a few decades later, right, in England for the first time. Like, the concept of the state, not the government, but the state as such. And so, there's certainly many different ways to organize our social lives and organize the way that we, sort of think about the world. And I think that he's right to talk about, or at least conjecture for us, that it's reasonable for him to conjecture for us that we entirely conceptualize the way that we conceptualize the entire world, the way that we think about news is entirely through this angle of the limits of the state's action. If the state domain doesn't extend to this or that thing, well, then it's not really news. It might be gossip, it might belong in a tabloid, but it's not serious news. Serious news is the limit of the state's domain. Right. And so I think that that's like an interesting approach to thinking about the world. And I think that that provides for us a lesson to think for ourselves and how we can develop our own potentials. So I found that to be valuable in this chapter, at least.
Yeah. And another connection that he draws between the state and the and basically capital, so thus, if a company ruins its competitors by cheap fares, it is often enabled to do so because it is reimbursed by land given to it by the state for gratuity. And we see this now in our own system where some companies that are very profitable, they get huge tax breaks and stuff for certain projects. Like we saw the telcos get hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks for building out these networks that we can all have cell phones for. And yet we still, we don't get to share in those profits. We helped build the network with our tax dollars. The state gave them basically a big tax break, but we don't see the benefits of that, right? It just allowed this company to get really big.
But even there though, like, the reason why it's news is because the state was involved in it, right? Because the state did some kind of tax break. Well, then it's serious news. Well, what about the things that the state was not involved in? What about isn't it just as much, I think Kropotkin would suggest, or at least conjecture to us, isn't it just as much a question of the state where the state was not involved? Because the question is, well, why wasn't the state involved, right? Like, oftentimes, we'll get mad at something. Well, there should be regulation here. Well, what kind of a claim is that? What kind of a claim is that, right? It's a claim about the state. And so there is a certain sense, perhaps, in which you can't ever escape the state's domain in a world in which the state does exist. So it's either a question of should the state be there or should the state not be there in a certain way. There's obviously nuances to approach it, but I don't know, it's kind of interesting. Now, he moves in a little bit, and this is where I start to wonder what he's up to here, because he talks about here, I'll just read this quote here. He says, "We therefore propose to point out to some of these striking manifestations and show how men, or today we would add women, as soon as their interests do not absolutely clash, will now act in concert, harmoniously, and perform collective work of a very complex nature." Now, the thing about that I want to ask is, well, what are the things which makes it so that our interests don't clash? He doesn't really tell us. He suggests that the state prevents our interest from working in harmony, but I'm not. He doesn't necessarily make that argument there. It seems like that's the central argument, because the defenders of the state, the defenders of government, will argue, well, the purpose of the government is to align interests with one another. When interests clash, the role of the state should be to come together. This is the argument of sort of the pro-state. They would say, well, the role of the state, the role of the government would be then to balance out to balance things out, right? Like, you either levy a tax, you have some kind of fine, so that then interests can work in harmony together, and they can, come together through free agreement and move things forward. There's other conceptions of the state, certainly, right? Because that conception of the state would be that the purpose of the state is to maximize free enterprise, right? But that seems to be the dominant view of the state under neoliberal capitalism, right? But that would be the approach that a neoliberal would respond to Kropotkin, and he doesn't have an argument to that. And that would at least today, is the main argument for the state. So I would like to have seen more complicated arguments from Kropotkin, which really deal with the substance of it. Because, he goes on here and he says, and I'm just going to read this paragraph here. It's a sort of short paragraph here, but just to show an example here, he says, but what concerns us is not to give examples which might be blindly followed, and which moreover which present society could not possibly give us. What we have to do is to show that, in spite of the authoritarian individualism which stifles us, there remains in our lives, taken as a whole, a very great part in which we only act by free agreement, and that therefore it would be much easier than is usually thought to dispense with the government. I'm not sure that quite follows, right? Because he's saying that, well, if what we do is we show examples of how in our life we can still, right, we still have free agreement, it follows that it's easy to dispense with the government. But that doesn't respond to the objection that the government's role is to make sure that people's interests don't clash. I don't know, like it seems like he's missing a really big part of it here. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kropotkin has kind of maybe painted himself in a corner. I mean, his approach throughout this book seems to be he's a very all or nothing kind of a guy, because if you kind of take half measures, then those half measures seem to get corrupted one way or another, right? If you try to control capital is going to find a way around that, which we see today, right? We put regulations on the banks and they find some other way, some other workaround, right? It was 20 years ago, it was Enron. Then they did that, then we kind of fixed that stuff. Then they found another way to crash the housing economy. They're always finding different ways of these workarounds. So the answer then is to eliminate the capitalists. And it's the same thing with the state. I mean, we have lots of examples throughout history of the state acting not in the people's best interest, and it could be argued that we can see states where they are not aligning interests, they are sort of creating their own new interests that they want to follow, being corrupted. So I think he takes that same approach. Well, if we take a half measure to government, it's just going to work itself back in, to that corrupted territory. So the answer then is to eliminate it, is to essentially do without it completely, and then we'll just kind of get by on our own. Right. So I think that's kind of his approach that he has to take, which is obviously a very sort of hard line to take, which is, it's all or nothing. There's no kind of compromise in the middle, but that sort of seems to be his style of doing those things.
Yeah, and what's interesting is he's giving us examples here about the railroad, right? So that's kind of what he really focuses in on. And I will say, if you ever go to law school, be prepared to read a lot of texts about railroads or any kind of class in law. Just you're going to read railroads, or even you pick up a textbook in law, which is kind of what I did. I picked up a textbook in law, and basically it's like a bunch of stuff about railroads, because railroad law is a paradigm example for a lot of other cases, and they were very, there was a lot of money involved at the time, and this is when legal systems were, especially in America, were really coming into being to help think about issues of capital and think about these things. And so railroad is, I think, a really smart example. But now his case, though, is interesting, right? Because he's giving us an example, as Chris mentioned earlier. He's talking about how, all these railroads came together and they had all these free agreements and the like. The thing, though, is we also need to remember this very concept, which Kropotkin is hailing, only a few decades after Kropotkin's death, morphed into the European coal and steel community. In other words, they needed to have the state involved in order to regulate and maximize efficiency together so that they could compete with the United States, right? You had, what was it, Italy, France, Belgium, Luxembourg. There was 6 countries, I can't remember, to start with. And that those countries came together and formed the basis of what then later became the European Union. But so I find it interesting that the very example which Kropotkin uses to show why we don't need the state, it ended up being just a few decades later, ended up needing the state in order to compete with the United States, in order to sort of maximize efficiency, in order to maximize they were having all kinds of issues with trading and the like, and that was the only way that they were going to be able to compete with the United States. So I find that interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's a complicated thing that you want the state to be in there in order to align these interests like we've talked about, but sometimes that's sort of not what the state is actually doing. So it's trying to sort of structure this idea I'm trying to say. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that then. Yeah,
Yeah.
I hear your
Yeah,
point.
no,
I hear what you're
I
saying.
just like it's just interesting, right? Like he gives like really compelling examples and sort of thought experiments in theory about how, we don't need the state in order to, maximize efficiency when it comes to railroad development and the like. But at the end of the day, the very example that he used ended up requiring the state in order to develop this community in order to compete with the United States. Now, the reason why the United States was able to produce coal and was able to produce steel so efficiently was because it was one state. It didn't have all the different borders. It didn't have to deal with the different laws. So I suppose Kropotkin does have a kind of response, right? But the only way that Europe was going to be able to compete with something like the United States really was to come together and to stop having basically like simplify and formalize, have one legal set to deal with, all these different transnational stuff with steel and coal. And again, it ended up morphing into the European Union because they were like, wow, we can compete with the United States on steel. Let's try all these other products. And then they developed the European Union, and they're like, oh, wow, well, let's try to, have one single currency,
Right.
and there ended up being problems there. But, like it's interesting to me how Kropotkin's very example kind of fell in on itself a little bit if you add a couple decades to it. But again, I mean, he has interesting examples for how in the United States he talks about how I think it was it the Vanderbilts or something that like sometimes they'll have trains go on extra like long routes basically so that then the Vanderbilts could get a little bit of money. They'll like
Right.
uh,
Right.
I don't know enough about that historical example, so I can't comment on it, but that's interesting that apparently that happened, right? That, you'd have trains going through and then they just go on a random detour so that then the Vanderbilts can get a little bit of money. I don't know anything about that historical example, so I'm not sure how that happened or what was the context of that, but that's certainly interesting. And I wonder if stuff like that still happens today, certainly.
Right.
Um,
Of course, yeah. I mean, that's
yeah.
how the decisions get made now. Does it make some capitalist money? Yep. Okay, then we're going to go ahead and do it.
Right.
And I would think there would be a bit of a rebuttal here to the comparison of the train system in Europe versus the United States, because I think you could probably write an entire book about how the train system. Obviously, the train system was pivotal in the country for helping the country get a boost and increase itself sort of economically. And yet, look at the amount of suffering and inequality and all of these things that are also connected to the trains in the United States, right? The abuse of many of the workers who were essentially treated like slaves, very unhealthy situations, people dying. Right? If you were the one unlucky enough to be picked to go put the dynamite in, then you probably had about a week left before you accidentally blew yourself up and they replaced you with someone else. I mean, horrible situations that you could make that argument. Well, that American system, it served the purpose of putting those trains down, but it made some people very, very rich at the cost
Yeah.
of the well-being
Well,
of the
also,
society.
that also happened in Europe, though. Like, it's not like that didn't happen in Europe as well. It was different, from my understanding, because you had different countries enacting it differently. So the laws were different in each country.
But I think theoretically, if you were doing this under a society where it was people sort of deciding together how to organize, how to build the trains, it seems to me
certainly,
like
right.
like the way he's sort of in his utopia, you wouldn't have people saying, okay, this certain one job, people only last about a week in it before they blow up, but that's just the price
Right.
of getting
That
a
just
train
it
made.
wouldn't
You
happen.
hopefully would have a little
Right.
bit more consideration for fellow humans as you do this.
Right, it wouldn't happen, and Kropotkin would say that, well, then you're going to obviously have like a much more efficient train system because of that. That's, I suppose, an empirical question, right? I don't know that we have a hypothetical counterexample, but right, like, I mean, it obviously seems like capitalism doesn't take into account the fact that people died blowing themselves up, making, right, like, how do you put a utilitarian calculus on that?
Right.
And would you want to use utilitarian calculus to calculate something like that? Is it the case that utilitarianism tells us anything meaningful about morality? It seems to put the cart before the horse in many ways.
Right.
Right. Um, So then he also has some interesting examples about the Red Cross. He has interesting examples about the Lifeboat Association, something that we met earlier in the book, um, talking about how lifeboats are constructed to save people, and that this is an entirely voluntary association, that it's run largely through donations, and that this is basically an anarchist society. This is a favorite example of his. I've read numerous things talking about how Kropotkin, in basically all of his writings, talks about the Lifeboat Association and how this is like amazing, and that this is like sort of his pinnacle example of how an anarchist society could work. And I find that interesting. It's a good example. I don't know that it really tells us that like an entire society could work this
Right.
way, right? Like it's interesting. Um, but yeah, and he talks about, for instance, the modesty of the Lifeboat Association, that they don't actually, they're so modest that they withhold their votes. The workers of the Lifeboat Association will withhold their votes on matters which involve the Lifeboat Association, out of a kind of modesty, whereas he says that like state politicians, they would never do something like this, which is true, certainly. So I don't know. I don't know how analogous this is, or what like this really tells us. What do you think, Chris? Like how successful is he here?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're good examples of people, or good examples of people coming together and being able to achieve what we
Really
would think
great
of as
things.
being, what was that?
I would say really great things.
Yeah, really
Achieving
great
really
things,
great
and things that
things.
you at first might think are too complicated to achieve without a hierarchical system, that you might go, oh well, we got to put someone in charge, and then everyone below them has to answer to the person above them, and this whole system, and I think it is interesting to point out, you don't necessarily need that. You have people that are gonna step up and do things that many of us might consider undesirable, but you're gonna have people who step up and say, nope, this is my calling, I have to do this kind of Red Cross job, or I think it's important, I'm gonna go help organize how the boats work. One thing that I do think about throughout the book, and I kind of hoped he was going to address, but I feel like maybe hasn't been addressed to the level that I would like to see, and it doesn't look like maybe it's going to. I don't see how it would fit into any of these chapters. What happens when someone just says, forget the rest of you, I'm taking my boat to the front of the line? I mean, he does mention in here that if you do that, if you try to cut in line, you're now out of the group, right? But
Hmm.
you got to figure there's going to be people that still try to do that kind of stuff. And I don't know, I'm not convinced that in every situation, not being part of the group is going to be enough of a disadvantage. I mean, it seems like it does in this boat group where they're all, is this the same one, or is it a different group where the people are ordering how the boats are going to come in and how long you can stay docked before you have to leave and go back, take your ship out, so make room for someone else. And it seems like in this situation it works, but I feel like we could find situations where not, sort of being exiled from a group, if the group isn't big enough, then maybe being exiled from a group isn't enough of a threat, and you could sort of go try to impose your will, and there
Right.
wouldn't be enough of a counterweight against that. I think most people would actually act pretty good in this situation. I think the vast majority of people would be good faith actors in a situation like this. But I do think you've got, what, 1% of the population are, psychopaths and stuff, are going to operate differently, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean it's really difficult because again, he goes back again, like what he says at the beginning there is that when our interests do not clash, we work well in accord and harmony together. And I agree with that. When your interests don't clash, we work well together just fine. And when our interests in fact align, then we work really, really, really
Right.
well together. But I think it sort of begs the question, well, what situations create for having aligned interests? How do we align our interests with one another? And that's a question which Kropotkin just seems to think that would sort of work itself out through free agreement. That through free agreement we would work out our best interest, and that this would kind of just work. I really wish that he would give a more robust answer to this. He closes this chapter here. He closes chapter 11 with the lines here, and yet the facts we have quoted only give us a glimpse of what free agreement has in store for us in the future, when there will be no state. But again, I mean, the argument for the state has always been, at least the neoliberal state, right? The asterisk there, the neoliberal state has always been that the role of the state is to bring interest into accord with one another. You either tax some some group, you put fines, whatever you have to do in order, you whip their hands or whatever, and whatever you have to do in order to bring interest into a line so that you can have the most efficient capitalist society. That's the argument for state neoliberalism, right? And he doesn't really respond to that objection. And oftentimes, the reasons why these free associations popped up is because of state failure. In the case of, like, why wasn't the state or the government involved in, like, making sure that their own cargo could get to shore safely? So then you had people in lifeboats rescuing people, when their ships would start to sink, right? So it seems like, and also the other example that he uses is the Red Cross, where, you have wars because of states. And so it seems to me that these free associations are popping up in areas of state failure. Does it follow then that once you get rid of the state, that these associations, A, would still exist, and B, that there would just be more of them? I wish he would argue for that. He hasn't argued for that, at least as of yet. Maybe future into the book, we still got this much more to go, so maybe further into the book he'll give us those arguments. But as of yet, if we're going to give an honest commentary of where the book is so far, he's told us this, but he hasn't argued for it.
Yeah, and I think it was a good point you made earlier about the distinction where we're talking specifically about the state, because when you hear other people talk about this type of government that Kropotkin is arguing for, you still would have these sort of groups of organizations, right? You'd have these communes or whatever, where you have people making decisions. You still have something going on. You just wouldn't have this giant overseeing the state,
right,
that is sort of imposing its will. It would be much more of a equal type situation where you're much closer to having the will of the people, right, being carried out, because you have a much smaller
and bringing
local government.
Right, and bringing the interest into accord. But what happens when two communes have conflicting agreements, conflicting interests? So it's interesting. We'll have to see how this plays. Anything else to add to this section today, Chris?
I guess the only thing I would add is that like you were talking about efficiency earlier, and it seems like sometimes now efficiency is used to actually do things that would be harmful to people. So we see, big companies get bought, dismantled, tens of thousands of people lose their jobs, all in the name of, oh no, we're not doing anything wrong. We're just making these companies more efficient, right? We're going to break them up, sell them off for pieces, and we're making it all more efficient for people. So that same efficiency argument can be used the other way around, which is not to the benefit of people. So I guess it's kind of a careful, you have to be careful with that concept a little bit, because it can actually be used, against the good of the people or the will of the people.
Well, Kropotkin would say that, like, if you had true efficiency, that then the interest would come into a line in a certain sense. Like, you're right in the capitalist system, but what do they mean by efficiency? They mean maximize profit for income spent. Right. So, it seems like Kropotkin would say, well, you have a perverted concept of efficiency, and that's why once you have a totalizing concept of efficiency, then interest will accord with one another, and that they're going to come into harmony. And so far, at least, it seems like that's a bit of hand waving to me, at least. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but I haven't seen the argument for it yet. So anyway, yeah, that's this section of the book. Also, I will say he hasn't talked much about the environment and how we bring and make sure that people have, if we're just talking about maximizing efficiency and well-being, like, how do we make sure that we're not polluting too much? Maybe that's something that, he didn't really think about because of when the book was written, but that would be something we'd have to consider today. So anyway, thanks guys so much for joining us and hanging out with us for the book club, the Peter Kropotkin book club. Next time around, I think we're maybe just going to look at chapter 12. It's a pretty long chapter. Okay. And if we linked it in with chapter 13, I think it would maybe be a bit unbearable, even if only chapter 12 is maybe slightly short. But if we did both 12 and 13, it would probably be too much. So next time around, we'll just look at chapter 12 of the Conquest of Bread for next week. We're going to be live again Wednesday at 7:30 Eastern, 4:30 Pacific. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. If you want to stick around, we'll be chatting about the news. We'll be chatting about politics, all the crazy stuff going on later today. So, Chris, when do you want to chat about that? Do you want to do that in like 15 minutes or 10 minutes?
Break or so? And kind of organize and then do that. Yep. So thanks everybody for checking things out, and we'll see you hopefully in a little bit. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
All right. See you guys.